And I want to thank you for being here. It makes me feel special, and it makes the school of the Graduate School of Education feel special as well that you're here for my presentation. So, I'm Theodore G. Zervas. I'm the Distinguished Visiting Professor for this semester in the Graduate School of Education. And this is the second lecture I'm doing. And this lecture, I titled it Coming to a Common Consensus on Who We Are, Comparing National Identity Formation in American, Greek, and Egyptian Schools. But before I get started, I wanted to say something a little bit about myself. I know that a lot of my students are here, and my colleagues are here, they already know me, but this is just for sort of people that don't know who I am. That's me. So I'm a professor of education at Northwestern University in Chicago. I did my bachelor's degree in history at DePaul University. I have a master's also in history, and a master's in education from Northwestern University, and a doctorate degree from Loyola University in Chicago. And oops, sorry about that. Thank you, Habiba. That's me. All right, good. So I did my Ph.D. in the history of education and as well as comparative and international education. My last presentation was more about comparative and international education. And this, today's topic is going to be more about national identity and some of the work that I've done in national identity formation in schools, but also looking at history textbooks. And how nations decide what to leave in and basically leave out of their textbook, and what they feel to be as important in their textbooks. I started teaching as a high school teacher. I gotta remember to do this. It's getting stuck. Okay, we'll do it this way. Okay, so I taught history for 7 years in an international baccalaureate school in Chicago. Currently teaching at Northwestern University, and I also have international teaching experience in Mexico and China. These are my research interests: history of education, educational policy, nation building. We'll focus more on national state building and education, and national identity formation, as well as social studies education. That's Elenios, my son, and that's my wife, Kara, and they'll be here on Thursday. And they're very excited to be coming to Cairo. And this is what we're going to talk about. Textbooks. We'll talk about the United States and how they teach history in the United States and revisions to history textbooks in the United States. We'll look at a few other places. Barcelona. This, by the way, is Barcelona. You can see the Sagrada Familia right over here, Gaudi's famous church. We'll talk about Greece, and we can't forget Egypt. And finally, we'll sort of end with sort of idea of who you are and who we are. So why are textbooks important? Now, the literature tells us, and those that write on this topic, Michael Apple, Linda Christian Smith, Paulo Freire, who I know that a lot of you have read. They say that, and Henry Giroux, they agree that textbooks are a vehicle that achieves a particular political, cultural, and social goal. And this is completely intentional. When textbooks are written, it's completely intentional what people decide to put in their textbook. It's not just something that happens randomly. They're also windows to understanding the world from a particular society's point of view, how a society sees itself and how it wants to be seen by others or the world. And through the textbook, the student may become politically and culturally indoctrinated. And the indoctrination word is sort of a scary word, right? It means that they're sort of brainwashing, right? And then the student will form in his and her consciousness a sense of national identity. Now, it's a sort of complicated topic when we talk about national identity, but it basically means like, what is it that you have in common with somebody of the same country from you? What is it that sort of brings you together? Basically, that's what it comes down to. It could be language, it could be religion, and it could be a common national history. And how do you learn these things? You learn these in school, and you learn these in what's in the textbook. So the way that history is written and the way it is taught in schools plays a significant role in shaping this national identity. History textbooks have traditionally served as a tool for transmitting historical information. A national history can enable an individual to connect to the events, movements, and personalities of the past, while at the same time collectively identifying with the members of a community. How do people of a nation feel connected? Do we personally know our ancestors? Do we personally know the people from our nation? Right? Somebody could be living in Luxor, somebody could be living in Cairo, but somehow we feel connected to them, right? And I sort of give this as a sort of example, and I sometimes ask myself, when you're in a place where there's not a lot of Egyptians, let's say, you run into another Egyptian, you get excited. And they say, yeah, of course I get excited. I always get excited when I see a fellow Egyptian. Now, my next question is, why do you get excited? You don't know this person, right? But you get excited, right? You get more excited than if you ran somebody that wasn't Egyptian, right? Okay, so this is really what I'm getting at here, especially in how students learn in school and how they're taught national history. So we have to remember that history is constructed. What is historically important is often, it's not made up, it's constructed, it's developed, it's thought about by people. And this includes people, places, and events. They can be glorified. And then the question is, how does one decide what is important in history, right? So when we look at Egyptian history, we're looking at, even just looking at ancient Egyptian history, you're looking at, almost 1,000 years, right? And that doesn't include what happens afterwards, right? So the textbook is only so many pages to be taught in school, right? Or during the course of primary school or high school. You obviously can't include everything in the textbook, right? It would be impossible. So then the question is, what do they decide to put in the textbook? Why do they decide to put whatever's in the textbook? And who decides to put that in the textbook? And ultimately, who benefits from what's in the textbook? Okay? So this is a cover of an American history textbook, George Washington. And if we look at the sort of history classes around the world, you'll find that most countries have their own national history that's taught in schools. So in the United States, typically students are sophomore year, take US history. I was at a conference once with Canadian teachers, and they were talking about Canadian history that was taught in sophomore year for their students. And I was sort of shocked that there was such a thing as Canadian history, because I didn't know anything about it, right? So, and then this is a sort of conscious decision about who to put in a textbook. And they put George Washington. And George Washington on the textbook, why? I know Thomas knows, but...
Because he was the first president of...
Okay, he's the first president.
And he has, because I think there's a story about the cherry tree, so...
All right, there's a lot of story, the founding of the country. Okay, but more than that, were you gonna say something?
He's on the dollar bill?
He's on the dollar bill. It's sort of the president we could all agree on, that we all like. That's what it comes down to, right? So whether you're sort of Democrat or Republican, we all like George Washington, right? When we get into like Kennedy or Reagan or Roosevelt, then it gets sort of murky. We could also agree on like Abraham, like everybody agrees on Abraham. And then you see like the number of schools in the United States, I think the most common name for schools is Washington School in the United States. More schools are named after George Washington than that. And then it's like, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln School or Lincoln Elementary School. So And then if you just look at the title, Heroes of American History, we're learning about the heroes of America, these great people. So it's sort of romanticized to, you know, these great heroes in American history. And this is sort of the first impression that a student would get it when they took American history. We're learning about the heroes of America. Isn't that great? We have heroes. And George Washington is one of the heroes. This is a sort of famous image. It's Manifest Destiny. And this is something in the 1800s that sort of promulgated to the public. And the notion of sea to shining sea. So, and this is a real painting, and you would see it a lot in American history textbooks. Here you see the Brooklyn Bridge. This is New York City. And you sort of see this western expansion. Sea to shining sea means from the East Coast to the West Coast. And basically it was a sort of movement to move westward. Take land at the expense of Native Americans, right? And then it's sort of, you have this sort of angelic figure leading the path, right? This is a good thing, right? Look at her, she sort of looks like an angel. And she's leading them from coast to coast, okay? Now, this is something I pulled up from Cuba. So, anybody knows who this is? Che Guevara, of course, right? So, Che Guevara is not Cuban, he's Argentinian. He fights in Cuba, he dies in Cuba. He's a national hero in Cuba. They don't put maybe Castro's in some other pages in there. But the children are learning the word ch in Spanish, right? Che Guevara. So, cha, che, chi, cho, chu. El che, mucho in Cuba. Mochila, right? So, and this is sort of, with the elementary student, they're not necessarily going to understand the sort of intricacies of revolutions, right? How they happen, and that's a little bit too complicated for them. But they are going to understand this. This is Che Guevara. He's on my book, in my book, so obviously he's very important, right? Okay, so this is sort of first exposure. Egypt, right? And this is a sort of thing that sort of tries to encapsulate what Egypt's all about. Ancient, Islamic, Coptic Christian, right? So I was telling Dr. Thomas Wosley when we were getting some food, I went to the Starbucks to get some coffee, and Starbucks has these sort of mugs around the world, depending on what city you are, that sort of showcases the city, and it sort of pictures of what the city is all about. And the one in Cairo is this. It's exactly what this is, right? It sort of took this image and put it on this mug. Anybody know what this is? This is Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, right? So before Kemal Atatürk was the national leader of Turkey, he was the general during World War I, okay? And this is him looking over the battlefield during World War I. Even though the Turks lose the war, they are successful in battle. Gallipoli, where Kemal Atatürk was a general, okay, defeating the Australian and New Zealander forces. China. I like this one. This is my favorite. And I like this because you notice the girl, she's holding a pen, but it's a bayonet. China again. And you get this sort of image here of the soldier. You get over here spewing out the rhetoric, the communist rhetoric, the workers, which were important for communist China, and again the soldiers over here. Soviet Union, during Stalin here, Lenin here, both national heroes, and then you have young Russians sort of marching in front of them. And again, Soviet Union, Communist Russia under Stalin. A boy putting a picture of Stalin on the wall, holding the Soviet flag. Again, he's a national hero. And this was found in the Russian textbook. Okay, so this is something that we have to remember, that things can change, right? What could have been important is no longer important. What wasn't important can become important, okay? And sometimes this all depends on who might be in political power. So what was bad in South Africa is good. What was good in the United States is now bad. What wasn't important became important. What was forgotten is remembered. And what divided unites. Okay, and these are some of the examples how history can change. And what we call this is revisionist history. And it happened in the beginning in the United States in the 1960s. So, what happened in the 1960s? Obviously the civil rights, right? The social and cultural revolution in the United States. And what the attempt is to make history more inclusive. So, typically history was written from the perspective of great men, okay? It wasn't about people. It was about figures in history that changed things. Usually individuals, and usually these individuals happen to be men, right? The shift happens when people will say, okay, it's not just about these people that make the change, but it's really people, these movements, about movements that are the ones that are doing this change. So African Americans, Latinos, women, and other minority groups were pretty much excluded from these textbooks, or they were portrayed negatively or peripherally, okay? So it could have been a comment about slavery in the United States, but it didn't go into detail about it. Yeah, there were slaves, right? Or slaves weren't treated bad, okay? So it wasn't really giving the right account of what was happening. So more people wanted these revisions, and they wanted social and political movements and contributions by other minority groups in the textbooks. And if you can imagine, if I'm a student that's African American in school, and all I read is about people that are not like me, I'm not going to be interested in it, right? So, or if I'm Latino, or if I'm a woman, it's not telling me about women historical figures. It's going to be hard for me to sort of connect to the history, okay? And that was another sort of goal that they were trying to do, to help students connect to the history. So this is what I like to say, glorified past. And I mean, if you look at this image, it's an image from a textbook. It's, like Native Americans and, the Pilgrims getting along, they're having dinner together. And this is part of the national narrative of Thanksgiving. We all got together and ate. We all liked each other. Which is not true, okay? It's, this is not really how it happened. Maybe they had dinner once, I don't know, right? But for the most part, this is not what the history is all about, okay? So, this is sort of glorifying the past. And then you have myth versus reality. Here you have George Washington, right? George Washington had slaves. And then you have these slaves working alongside the whites. It seems sort of blissful and happy. People are happy. So, I mean, this image doesn't give an accurate portrayal of what slavery was really about in the United States. And these are the sort of images that sort of get people sort of riled up, that this is not really how it happened. And sometimes the images are just like blatantly racist, the happy-go-lucky sort of black slave, right? That it's not so bad to be a slave, like they're dancing, they're happy, they're drinking, that sort of thing. And one of the most popular revisionist histories were James Lowen's Lies My Teacher Told Me, and then Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. Okay? So Howard Zinn, both of them are looking through it from the lens of the social history. And Lowen's book is really saying that what we learned in school, we really didn't get the truth, and here's the truth. Okay? And Howard Zinn does something very similar. Now, when I taught history, we used Howardson's book, but we also used a book by Baylor, who did more of a sort of conservative history, traditional history. Okay? And we had students read both books and sort of make a decision on their own of what was the history that they accepted. Okay? And these were sort of different interpretations of history. So conservatives in America rejected the change. They felt that the revised history portrayed the United States negatively, and students would grow up hating America. Christian conservatives believed that the forefathers should be portrayed in textbooks as being inspired by the Bible and Christianity. And divisions of symbols such as the city on the hill and the Puritan versus the Enlightenment revolutionaries were debated. And these, to me, are the greatest sort of how they show what I think the unconscious division, the historical division of the United States is. It's whether the founders were these religious people or whether they were secular. Okay? Now, the sort of argument that I see recently that the forefathers were driven by Christianity. Do you know anything about the American forefathers? A lot of them were Unitarians and deists, and if you're a Unitarian or deist, traditional Christian will never view them as Christians. Okay? So this is kind of ridiculous that somebody like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, who were Unitarians and deists, would be viewed, who helped write the Constitution, and they were significant figures, that they would be driven by Christianity. Did they grow up in a sort of Christian community? Sure. But the idea that they were inspired by Christianity to write the Constitution is kind of ridiculous. So the city on the hill is something you hear all the time, especially during, at least when I was growing up in the 80s, 90s, especially by politicians, the city on the hill. And the reason they used it was because they knew it captured both sides. The city of the hill of the pure religious people, Puritans, and the city of the hill of the secular, the democracy of ancient Athens, right? So it sort of captured both. And then you have this sort of image. The one is Jesus sort of inspiring these forefathers to write the Constitution, and the other one is the light, the secular light, not necessarily the religious light. And this is the light of the Enlightenment, okay? And how are textbooks chosen in the United States? Each community or even school may decide which textbooks to use. Typically, textbook companies try to sell and market their books to a school or a district. Experts like professors and teachers either write or consult on what should be in the textbooks. And not all textbooks are the same. So the American Civil War is portrayed differently in textbooks in the South than in the North. Okay? And it depends where you live, what could be in the textbook, and how a particular event might be treated. Certain figures or events may be excluded. And again, there's only so much that can be covered in a textbook. And this is just not in the history textbook, but it could also be in the literary canon, meaning what writers are we going to read in English class? Okay? Are we going to read more traditional writers, or are we going to read some of these sort of new authors as well? So let me shift gears, and I want to talk about other countries. So this is the EU, the European Union, and in general, history textbooks in the European Union states have become more similar in the last 60 years. And they become more similar because of European integration. What the European Union is trying to find a sort of commonality between the people of the various countries in Europe, okay, the member states. There's less focus on national history, and there's more of a centric national history model. They shifted from the centric national history model to concepts, human rights, different but equal, the Enlightenment and humanity, and becoming more common. Now this has caused problems even within the European Union, right? There's some countries in the European Union that are more religious than other countries, right? So the countries that are more religious, maybe they want more religious themes in their textbook because it's part of their culture. Okay? So this creates a sort of problem
even within the European Union. Not all countries in the European Union were part of the Enlightenment. It's not part of their history. England. Now, English textbooks that tend to be narrative, and I'm just giving you a sort of synopsis, concrete and stress the unbroken connection between present day and historical England. So there's a sort of continuum in England from history until today. It's unbroken, and distinctions are made between English textbooks between the British Isles and the people of Europe. So the British want to be seen that they're not necessarily part of Europe or European, that they are distinct. And from a historical perspective, you could sort of make that argument with England. German textbooks are more problem-oriented and less focused on Germany's national past, for obvious reasons. And generally analyzes major political and social structures. German history is much more concerned with its relationship to the broader history of continental Europe. Albania. And Albania is interesting because it's one of the new countries to emerge after communism that's sort of negotiating what it means to be Albanian. So Albanian textbooks mention Albanians from the diaspora and the once grand Albanian nation. Yet little attention is given to the creation of a well-defined identity based on a historical past. They pay little attention to the nation's history before World War II, and the reason why it's a difficult past under Hoxha, under communism. And they also associate the wealth of the country with the success of its people. So the more wealthy the country, the better the people, right? Or the better the country. Turkey, like England, Turkish textbooks present Turkey and the Turkish people as distinct from Europe and the Middle East. And this is shown through their history, their Ottoman and Turkish history, and glorified Kemal Atatürk in modern Turkey, although we could argue that in some ways is changing today in Turkey. But it always welcomed the diversity of the people in Turkey. And that's what it means to be a Turk, right? That's sort of diversity. And then we have this idea of forgetting and remembering. Okay, so do nations try to forget their past? And do they conveniently leave out a part of their history? Do they remember a part of their history that is difficult? Okay, so what sort of could be difficult, could be used as a factor to unite people, right? So let's look at this. Israel. Israeli history textbooks focus heavily on the hardships of the Jewish people over time and an original Jewish homeland. Okay, so we're looking at this sort of hardship of this aspect of victimization. Japan. Japan tries to forget. So in the first decade of 2000, the Chinese government called out Japan for a revised edition of their textbooks that left out Japanese aggression towards the Chinese during World War II. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria appears in the Japanese textbook, but the textbooks make no mention of the massacre of Chinese civilians in Nanking. The textbook states that evidence has raised doubts about the actual number of victims claimed in the incident. Okay, so that's what they say. And then Armenia remembers, like Israel, they're going to remember their past. And but Turkey was concerned when the France decided to put in their textbooks about the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Turks. Most European states have included a discussion on the Armenian genocide in their textbook, but the Turkish government continues to question the extent of the massacre. Reconciling with one's past, Germany has acknowledged what has happened during the Second World War. If you go to Berlin, there's a Holocaust memorial in the middle of Berlin. United States, and this is something the United States still struggles with, reconciling with its past, its legacy with slavery, and its mistreatment of the native peoples of the United States. And then my next, most South American nations view Simon Bolivar as a national hero. And this, by the way, is an actual forensic recreation of what Simon Bolivar looked like. They used the skull to sort of recreate what his face looked, which is totally cool to me. But then you have sort of these sort of contentions that happen that this is our history, you're not getting it. And this is the case between Greece and what is, as of like 2 months ago, North Macedonia. So this is an interesting story. So North Macedonia was part of what was the former Yugoslavia in Europe. When the Yugoslavia fell apart, you had all these new countries emerge out of Yugoslavia. And one of the countries in the south decided to call itself Macedonia, much to the chagrin of the Greek government. Why? Because Macedonia, according to Greece, was part of Greek history, not part of this new place called Macedonia. And there's these sort of debates emerge, and there are sort of these interesting debates around history. So the Greek argument basically said, and I'll go through their arguments. Ancient Macedonians were Greek, they spoke Greek, shared the same religion with the other Greek city-states in ancient times, and spread Greek culture, i.e. Alexander the Great, probably in Egypt, right? North Macedonians don't even speak Greek, they speak a language that's Slavic, that's more like Bulgarian, and it's only until recently they call themselves Macedonian, right? And it's interesting because if you talk about Bulgarians that I've met, and I've gone to these conferences, if I ask them, well, can you communicate with somebody Macedonian, from Macedonia, they'll say, yeah, we speak the same language, right? So, and Greece has invested in its historical vestiges from the past, museums, archaeological sites, tourism, all that sort of stuff. And the majority of historians agree that the ancient Macedonians were Greek. Now, North Macedonia's argument is, we make no claims to sovereign territory. While we speak a Slavic language, some words we use are ancient Macedonian, which was a dialect of ancient Greek, but still distinct. Most Greek city-states did not view the Macedonians as Greek, but as barbarians. We are indigenous to the region and only adopted a Slavic language after the Slavic invasion in the 6th century. So because you speak a certain language, they're saying is, doesn't mean that's what we are. We just adopted that language, right? Okay, so there's an argument on both sides. So this went back and forth for almost 30 years. And what the Greek government decided to do was, they said to them, we're not going to allow you in the European Union and NATO until you agree to our concessions, right? And then finally, like 2 months ago, they agreed, and instead of using the name Macedonia, they forced them to use the name North Macedonia, and put in the constitution that they have nothing to do with ancient Greek, with Alexander the Great and ancient Greek history, which is fascinating how much a country can assert its power on another country over a historical argument. And this is more the reason why national identity is important. And then you have these instances like, so the country of Ghana is here, but then the ancient civilization of Ghana is there, right? So how does this, raise the question, how do they call themselves Ghana when they're here, when the ancient civilization is here, and Ghana is here? Doesn't make much sense. So this is basically how Greece did it when they created their national history. They become independent from the Ottoman Empire in the 1830s. And they decide to do it through the national school system. Because that's the best way to do it. Why? Because the national school system, you get kids all in a room, and it's easy to teach them and get the message out that way. So basically the school system is founded based on European models from Prussia, which is Germany, and France, and it's a Bavarian plan. The elementary school system is based on the French school system, and the secondary school system based on the Bavarian school system. What students learn In elementary schools, they studied Greek religion, both modern and ancient, mathematics, physics, hygiene, history, Greek mythology, and so forth. In high school, they repeated these subjects. Greek language, history, geography curriculum were considered more important than the other subjects, at least in the beginning. And the curriculum focus was intended to make them aware of the fatherland. Okay? And this was important, right? That even from the geographic perspective, all towns in Greece have a square. All towns have a church. These are the people that work in towns. Farmers. There'll be priests, there'll be housewives, that sort of thing, right? It was looking for similarities throughout the country. And this was completely intentional. Now, I like to say this, in other countries, new countries, especially Italy, it becomes a country in 1871. Germany becomes a country in 1872. Now, they don't turn to their ancient history. Italy doesn't go to like the Romans to unite its people, right? They look at their local folkloric traditions, the local literary traditions of the time. And they might go back to the Renaissance, the Italians, right? They'll create new monuments to unite the nation, right? So in Germany, it's a Cologne Cathedral. It's statues of the national hero, Otto von Bismarck. In Greece, instead of creating new buildings and new statues, what they do is they invest in their archaeology. They simply decide, sort of dust off what's already there, and that becomes part of their their monuments to showcase to the people and to the world. So it's taught in chronological fashion from past to present. It glorifies the ancient ancestors. So what this means is if I wasn't, let's say, Greek speaking, let's say that I was living in Greece and I spoke Aromanian, which is like Romanian, or Albanian, or a Slavic language, right? If I'm glorifying this history, then somebody who doesn't speak Greek or doesn't see themselves as Greek, they're going to say, why wouldn't I want to be Greek? These people have such a great civilization, right? You know, they helped set Western civilization, and all these other people around the world is learning about ancient Greek democracy. And it starts off with Constantine Papadopoulos, and he does the creation of a national history. And what he does is, and I'll show it over here, is basically he connects a history. So it's basically divided into three: ancient, medieval, and then modern. Okay? And it's one continuous link. It's unbroken. There's a connection from past to present. Okay? There's not a attitude that these ancient people and these Christian people were in conflict with each other. It's sort of put in a way that there was a sort of harmony. Even though these people were pagan and these people were Christian, somehow they got along, right? It was a sort of easy sort of transition. And in many ways, they're integrated in some way, right? And this is the sort of thing that even if you go to Greece today and you talk to a priest or a religious person, they're not going to disavow the ancient Greeks because of their religious practices. They will accept them. They, in some ways, admire them, right? And rarely you will find somebody that will say, well, those guys were pagans, a really religious person would say in Greece. They will accept them. They'll say that we admire them, they did great things. So this is patrognosis, knowledge of the nation, the fatherland, the grades. And I sort of put this diagram up here for you to see how they learned about history. I'm just going to move along a little bit here. These are the number of hours in school they spent in history. And then you sort of see these emblems all over Greece even today. There are these sort of ancient sort of folkloric traditions here, right? These pagan traditions that are still celebrated in these communities. You see people, you know, some time ago they're trying to sort of make these similarities of even like their facial characteristics to these ancient Greek statues. You have churches that look like temples, pagan temples. you have ancient Greek theater being performed on ancient theaters, right? And the play is being done in ancient Greek language, right? In the ancient theater where it happened 2,000 years ago. And then you have the music that sort of takes in these sort of characteristics from ancient Greece, from the instruments. You know, and then tattoos. I mean, if you go down Greek beach, you see all these people with these sort of tattoos of, you know, ancient Greece. So this is why I want to shift gears to Egypt. And maybe you can see some similarities and differences between some of the places we talked about. So, I mean, this is not my expertise, but I did find some information on what happens in Egypt. And it was really interesting to me because I didn't know a lot about it. So, most of it I drew from Ihab Abdul, and he did a study in 2015, and I think he's at McGill University up in Montreal. And this is the title of his paper. And if anybody wants my presentation, I'll be happy to forward it to them. And what he says is, in the early 1800s, education in Egypt was almost strictly religious. And this is sort of typical around the world. This is how, even in the United States, it's all religious in the beginning. Muslim and Coptic, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it, Kutabs, traditional rural religious schools existed in parallel with the modern educational system, became progressively more inclusive of students of different faiths. So the school sort of included both Coptic kids and Muslim kids. Then you have Ali Mubarak. He's the educational minister around the time, starting in, that should be 1868. Students from different religious backgrounds were able to participate in the same secular education process. So there's this sort of moving away from religious to more secular, which is sort of a trend going on globally. This is not just happening in Egypt. And then the colonial influence, from the late 19th century to the present, formal education has strongly contributed to the shaping of collective modern identity among Egyptians. Education was key in shaping and defining the new Effendia, right? An urban educated class that was in turn responsible for articulating several of modern Egypt's influential nationalist or super-nationalist ideologies such as Pan-Arabism, Islamism since the 1930s. Education in schools were also a means for discursively controlling the population to serve the colonial or national ruling political project and aspiration. And this is in his seminal book, Colonizing Egypt, although Mitchell writes about this. So the colonial schools are going to be there to serve the interests of the colonial powers first, and then the interests of the people, right? And then 1920s and 30s, with the influence of Egyptianist political movement, which emphasized the nationalist territorial vision of the Egyptian identity, civics textbooks showed a strong, inclusive identity that acknowledged and emphasized the country's diversity, historical and cultural continuity with ancient Egypt, and shared a source of inspiration for a unique Egyptian identity. This to me sounds just like Greece, what I was just talking about. Okay? So, and it's funny because it happens a little bit later, but, and again, countries don't sort of come up with this stuff themselves. They sort of borrow from other places of how they should do this. And then this is called Egyptianism, okay? And if you want to read more about it, it's the book on the bottom. And this is what it was. Cultural continuity among Copts, Muslims, and other groups living in Egypt. Focused on the socio-cultural history of the people, as opposed to the country's rulers and elites. Mohammed Hussein Haikal argued vehemently for how Egyptian customs, while partially influenced by incoming religion and language such as Christianity, Islam, and art, maintain a strong cultural continuity since ancient Egyptian times. So it's going back to ancient Egypt. And what they're trying to do is, just like in Greece, attempting to connect the ancient Egyptians to the modern Egyptians, right? Through this sort of folkloric traditions, finding, you know, maybe it could be cultural habits, it could be the music, it could be even the language. You know, there's a word in Egyptian that we use that we don't know really where it comes from, but it's probably an ancient Egyptian word, okay? In his writings, he refers to language, architecture, modern culture, and religious rituals as proof that ancient Egyptian customs continued in both the Coptic and the Muslim communities. And then post-colonial Nasser and Sadat, and this is where we have a shift happen. And again, the shift doesn't only happen in schools. Obviously, the shift is political, right? And usually when there's a massive political change, there's going to be a massive cultural change. And why would politicians like Nasser, Sadat be interested in schools, right? And this goes back to how I started with this indoctrination, support of the government, support of how things are. So they substitute this concept of Egyptian, I'm sorry, I'm in trouble saying it, with pan-Arabism or instilling pride for a greater Arab nation. And again, this pan-Arabism is not something that Nasser comes up with. These are sort of things that have happened in Europe. There was a pan-Slavic movement that the Russians were sort of pushing for a long time to sort of unite all these Slavic-speaking groups in Europe. And then you want to look at Hassan here, Christian versus Muslim in Modern Egypt, which is a book where I got this information. Also, according to Hassan, in the 70s and 80s, increasing content on Islam and Islamic history. So, you have Abdu's study of Egyptian history textbooks from grade 4 to 8, or grade 4 to 10, for the academic year of 2013 to 14. He found Egyptians embraced Christianity, which embodied values of justice, equity, mercy, tolerance. And this is sort of a chronology of how Egyptian history is. Egypt before Islam, and then Christianity. Christianity is good because it was a way out of paganism and ancient Egyptian religion. No discussion or mention of any scholarly research established the significant influence of ancient Egyptian religious beliefs on Judeo-Christian tradition. No reference is made to the influence of ancient Egyptian tradition on modern-day Egyptian art, rituals, and music. Hellenistic empires and Romans viewed as conquerors and occupiers, while the Arabs are viewed as liberator. And this is not uncommon as well, right? If we look at Greek history, which is my area, Romans are not seen as conquerors, they're embraced, but the Ottomans are seen as barbarians, and they're not embraced. And this is how others see ancient Egypt, which I think is interesting, right? So there's a new museum being built in Giza. It's over $1 billion, which is just pocket change, right? But it'll be interesting to see how they decide to showcase to the world what Egyptian history looks like in this museum. So in most schools around the world, you learn about ancient Egypt. And the kids get excited about ancient Egypt. They love ancient Egypt, right? They love reading about the ancient Egyptian gods. They love reading about the pharaohs and how they're mummified. It just gets them totally excited. I have a friend, when he was a kid, he's a retired school teacher, he told me, I used to sleep every night like the pharaohs. That's how much I love ancient Egyptian history and civilization. But the problem is that it's not treated as Egyptian history. In most textbooks around the world, it's treated as human history. What I mean is, it's part of the history of humankind. Okay? It's not exclusive to Egypt. Okay? And this could be problematic for Egypt, right? So kids will get dressed up in school like the pharaohs. I mean, it looks goofy, but kids like it. It's exciting, right? And then you have like these games. There's even an app for ancient Egyptians to learn about them. And then if you look around the world closely, you might notice something. There's the obelisk. Every major city that I've been to, I look for an obelisk. And my theory is that every major city has an obelisk. Okay? And this is an example. I mean, you have one in the heart of St. Peter's Square, the Vatican, right? There's an obelisk. Okay? There's obviously the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. That's an obelisk dedicated to George Washington, the father of the country. Okay? There's one in Argentina. Argentina here. So you see that it's everywhere. And sometimes it's just over the top. This is the Luxor Casino in Las Vegas. And you'll notice, I mean, this is called Luxor Casino, okay? And there's a pyramid here. It's supposed to be a pyramid in Giza. Okay, there's no pyramid in Luxor. So they don't quite get it right? But people go there and like, wow, this is what ancient Egypt looked like. you know, and then they'll get to stay in one of the rooms here when nobody lived in pyramids, right? It's only for dead people, right? But then you see it even in like, there's the Venetian Hotel. The Venetian Hotel is built to look like Venice. But if you look at even the Venetian Hotel, there's even fake cracks put on the walls. Because there's cracks in Venice today on the walls of buildings. So they try to be sometimes as realistic as possible. So you have the lots, but then you have this sort of thing going on here. Sharm el-Sheikh, right? The Clio Park. Right? So you come here, but it's being sold to tourists, it's not being sold to Egyptians, right? So come over here, you get to this water park, it's fun, it's Egyptian. And then you have the Chinese who love to copy things, and they're very good at copying things sometimes. So this is the real Sphinx. This is a replica built in 2016 by China. So why go to Egypt when you could come here to see the Sphinx in China? And the Chinese are notorious for even like building entire like little village, Austrian villages in like China. Exact replica, try to do exact replicas. You ride a roller coaster through the pyramid, how fun. And sometimes it's filled with conspiracy theories. You get these TV shows in the United States about how the pyramids were really built by aliens. There's no way these people could have done it. Carry those stones, it was impossible. So aliens came down and showed them how to do it. Okay? Not that they're not marvels in themselves, okay? But it gets kind of goofy. And then sometimes we all want to be Egyptian. So you had a movement for a long time in the United States, the Afrocentric movement, that many African Americans were saying that because we're African descent, our ancestors were Egyptian, and we brought civilization to the world. Okay, but then you see it in fashion, right? And you see it in movies as well. You know, this image of the Egyptians it's not just in Egypt, but around the world, this fascination about ancient Egypt. So this is where I want to conclude. Throwing the baby out with the bathwater. These are my final thoughts. Do nations selectively choose what to leave in or leave out in their textbooks? In the case of Egypt, there's such a thing as good colonialism and bad colonialism. Has Egypt reconciled with its ancient Egyptian or pagan past? Should Egypt consider a national history or a national narrative by drawing from its literary, artistic, religious, and folkloric traditions, or should it look more to its ancient past when constructing its own notion of what it means to be Egyptian? Finally, thank you. 4,000 years, and we're back to the same language. Okay, questions, discussion.
Professor, could you go back to the question?
Basically, I'm thinking about the last question, and what I think happens in Egyptian textbooks nowadays, and how history is constructed, that it's not just national narratives about Egypt's past. I mean, all of that is in there. So is a little bit of Coptic history, a little bit of Islamic history, but a large part, especially in Thanawiya Amma, in high school years, a large part of it is the military achievements of Egypt after the 1952 revolution. That gets a lot of attention. And all of the wars are explained in a very, very detailed way, but there's no narrative on Zionism or how, like the Lebanese have that, but Egypt doesn't. Like there's no narrative on Zionism and how Israel as a nation came to be, and very little is written about the Palestinians, but there's a lot written about Egyptian military history. And to some extent, I think that this could be one of the ways in which Egypt is constructing its own notion, what it means to be Egyptian. Because if we take it in a larger political context, then it should make sense to some people ruling this country that students learn up growing that your military is a source of pride. So I think that that's basically one of the things that makes Egypt today, what it means to be Egyptian, that it's the glory of the past, and then the military is trying to equate that kind of glory with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 military achievements.
Other questions? Thomas?
Is there a tension between the national narrative and the cultural narrative? Or is there some, where's that mesh?
In Egypt?
Here, or where?
This
Because
is,
there's always, there's a national narrative, or there could be a cultural narrative. They don't have to be the same thing, and often aren't the same thing, depending on the diversity of the population, colonial influences.
yeah, I mean, how do you get, I mean, the thing is, how do you get people to agree on everything?
Well, they should just listen to you.
They should just listen to me and I'll figure it out. But that's part of the problem. How do you agree what's important and what's not important? Something might be important to me, but it might not be important to you. So, and then it can get into like, how many pages of the textbook should be dedicated on this subject? And then what you're talking about, let's say military history, there's sort of really delving into what's happening, these military successes, spending a lot of time on that at the expense of something else. So this sort of thing, typically, it should be negotiated within the communities, right? To decide what they want to put in there. But then governments don't want the communities to do that because it's a way for them to get how they want their people to see themselves, whatever their agenda might be, political agenda or cultural agenda might be. We see this in the United States too as part of sort of the cultural wars. And that's what we get. That's what's happening now. It's happened for a long time in the United States. Why should we take out pages on why should we put more pages on, let's say, the slaves in the United States, right? Why should we dedicate a history on women in the United States? And it becomes politically, at times it becomes very politically heated, right? And it's everywhere all over the world. It's just not in the United States or just not in Egypt, but it happens everywhere. I mean, I always say this, I live in a major city in the United States, in Chicago, and I have more in common with somebody in New York City and Los Angeles, that's 2,000 miles away, than somebody that lives 50 miles away from me, right? And part of that is because, the history that I was taught in school, right, where I grew up, the people that I grew up around, right, versus somebody else 15 miles outside of Chicago, they've had a very different cultural experience and also very different worldview.
So perhaps individual identities get wrapped up in, or cultural identities get wrapped up in other traditional identities, and makes it very hard to tease.
Right, to tease out, right. Or you're being told what you are, right? Right?
Your example from Cuba was very interesting. I visited there 20 years, something like that, a long time ago. But one of the things that Castro and Guevara did was unite the country as in opposition to other forces.
Right.
And they did that in large part through education by creating a literacy brigade because the country was so impoverished. The literacy rate was below the floor. And they sent out these young people to teach
I talked about the enemy, finding a common enemy. I mean, that's a great strategy. Why? Because if we agree on a common enemy, then it means that we're not going to look at each other to find differences. Right? We have a question back there.
Yeah, Professor. Correct me if I'm wrong, you said that you were like a contributor to textbooks or?
I mean, not a contributor. I've looked at textbooks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in your opinion, is there like a best practices for a nation to somehow present their history or?
So, I mean, there's no best way, but there's good ways. Or there's ways that they attempt to allow, to make it a community effort. So if you open an American history textbook, you'll see that there's like a list of people that advise or consulted on the textbook. And it goes through the list of, there's teachers, there's professors, and it tries not to leave anybody out. And there might be a parent representative too. So typically that's how they try to do it. So they can say like, we did our best to get as many people involved in the process as possible. What they used to do in most countries, well, they'd have a competition. So they would send out a competition notice and they'd say, we're looking for somebody to write a history textbook for high school on whatever history, right? And then they would put the competition out and then these people would submit their textbooks and then there would be a committee that would decide which textbooks that they would use. Which is not as community oriented as, you know, getting as many stakeholders involved as possible, right? Yes. Oh, let me get this one first. Okay, it's fine.
My point is about the second question, which said, is there a good or bad colonialism? I wanted to talk about the difference of how we as Egyptians used to view the Ottoman presence in Egypt versus the British and the French. I think for a really long time, Egyptians, old Egyptians, in the centuries between 1200 and 800, they thought maybe the Ottoman presence in Egypt is about having a supreme Islamic sort of leadership or power that's empowered by the Khalifa, the supreme sort of authority in Turkey. So it wasn't really viewed as a bad thing as such. And I like to think that if it wasn't for the British or the French, we would have still under the Ottoman rule if it didn't collapse actually. The British, I think the biggest problem that we had is that they didn't pay attention to education, and particularly higher education. They didn't allow the creation of universities and so on and so forth. So if we can say there was a good colonialism as such, that would go for the Ottoman presence in Egypt. Certainly the bad ones were the French and the British, even though the French were really brief. The British was the worst, of course.
I'm thinking about, I mean, what was here before the Arab invasions?
What?
What was in Egypt before the Arab invasions? 641 AD.
Many other ones.
Yeah, I'm just saying, yeah, but there's a lot of, I mean, when I look at the trajectory, the chronology of Egyptian history, I see ancient Egyptians, I see Greeks, Romans, I see Arabs, you know, I see a long line of sort of colonists coming in. That's not, you know, French and British, but it's also Romans, it's also Arab. That's how I see it with the chronology.
This discourse of about colonialism or colonialism is as common in Egypt, but at the end of the day, colonialism is there is no better than colonialism. So if you say, you know, it wasn't by the British or the French that we still under the Ottoman Empire, I mean, how do you know that? How it's history? I mean, like.
They colonized us for 650 years. If
I
I
mean,
really don't.
it could have been like a lot of wars that would throughout the Ottoman Empire. I don't know. I can't really hypothesize this, but yeah, I mean, it's really a strong claim to say, or to feel the sense and have the tone of being grateful to the French and the British to say that they raised us from the Ottoman. I don't know. It's very different.
I mean, these are good discussions, Allah, so, I mean, these are really good discussions. Yes?
Well, we all know that there is so much international interest in Egypt, and we've seen that throughout the revolution time, during the revolution and after that, be it a foreign government or an international organization. And we're all aware, and I assume that we're all aware of how badly deteriorated the Egyptian educational system is, and it's not building people for the international future, if I have to say it that way. So what if Egypt really starts working on an effective educational system that builds characters in which the students are graduated to be critical thinkers, they can synthesize ideas and so forth. So what kind of reaction would we expect from these international bodies towards the system or towards the content of the system? Like, would they want us to talk about good colonialism, bad colonialism? And we have already mentioned earlier the fact that Egypt has been colonized by so many different nations before. So what kind of reaction should we expect at that point if we really start working on it effectively?
Yeah, I think Egypt needs to decide what they want, not what other people want.
Will they really leave the space for that? That's the question.
There's always going to be these sort of external influences coming into countries, right? And it can be very difficult to decide, but this is else needs to make for Egyptians, right? And there's vested interest why other people want to make these decisions for them, right? And we're talking about colonialism, why do colonists want to put their influence on another country, right? Because they want to have some sort of control, some sort of hegemony on that country. This is where the state and the people have to be strong and sort of make these decisions.
Yeah, no, there is the ideological hegemony, like people who are, or countries that are spreading their cultures throughout different ways. So what if this is the way that they can do it, actually?
So when we talk about colonialism and conquest, very rarely does nations, new countries, throw away everything from what was there. Usually they take what was there, even if it came from a colonial power or not, and they make their own. And this is the point. How do you make what's there brought to you? How do you make it where it's yours, or make it your own, or make it to fit within your sort of culture? This is the trick to it. Yes.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Actually, it's very resourceful. I have asked myself for a long period of time, I wanted to know, actually, who writes the history? This is my question, actually.
The simple answer is the winners, right? Right, the history.
So, who makes me to take what's written for granted like this?
Victorious.
And this is the truth.
Yeah, and this is what historians struggle with all the time. I mean, who writes the point is, you have these sort of different interpretations, so you can have these sort of discussions. I mean, there was, for a long time, there were historians debating on the causes of World War I, what Germany to blame, what Germany not to blame. And there were like tons of books reading about that. This is not a bad thing. This is completely healthy to have these sort of discussions, because it means that the community is engaged in these sort of discussions and you're sort of negotiating in real time. Or what is the sort of consensus that you want to have that's negotiated within the community? Now, you need a certain amount of flexibility, freedom to do this.
So I'll go back to my colleagues Ahmed's question and answering them and drawing on the connotation of the first question is, even if we are externally influenced by other governments, does really our political regime right now want us to know the history? So in Egyptian history, there are a lot of things that were left out just because it doesn't fit the national identity and so on. But for example, during my high school years, there were a lot talking about revolutions in different eras and how these are good and what are the manifestations of a revolution happening near. And in some questions, in some even all history, when you are reflecting in your own like situation, you feel a lot of marginalization and isolation through the history. You feel the history revealing itself. You feel like the manifestation of how education system is bad, and you can draw these reflections from reading the history. So in a way, there are things left out consciously and selectively by the regime, and there are things that are put into the curriculum based on the political power decisions, critical and selective decisions, but are things that spontaneously happen. So I was in Thanawi Amma during the revolution, and we were studying the history, and we were drawing comparisons even before the revolution, and it was a critical overview of the curriculum and the situation and reflection of on ourselves, and how this history can be revealed and how this is important. And this is something that the power dynamics at this time weren't really aware of. But what happens when this dynamic in the curriculum become highlighted to the power dynamics is even this part that is left in spontaneously and by being unaware is more highlighted, and then it's left out. So we'll have this just superficial of things happened 1 to 3 in these years, and you're not allowed to talk about it. Or even worse is, as my Sharifa colleague Mehmet said, is highlighting the achievements of a certain power to not just give it a legitimate power, but giving it a kind of unquestioned validity for any decision that they make.
I can't speak to what the goals are of the current government. I mean, I don't know. And I think a lot of people don't know. And I think it's happening in real time. What I can say is that anybody here can get their hands in a school textbook, right? And I think that what needs to happen first is somebody needs to do a really good textbook analysis of school textbooks, and sit down. There's templates out there of what other people have done, and to go through how much is this particular history being covered, and to go through these textbooks and say there's so much of, let's say, the military history being covered, this period of history being covered, and not so much of this, and so forth. And somebody needs to do that study. And once you have that evidence, then you can present that evidence and sort of make an argument that this is what's going on here, and this is what the sentiment may be for most people within the community, or what they want to see in the textbooks. I think that should be the first thing. Somebody needs to do some sort of study on that. I mean, I showed you the one that Ehab Abdu did, right? Which I think is a very good study. But again, like we were talking about before about history, somebody else needs to look at it too, to sort of start that sort of discussion, right? For that discussion to happen. And then people can sort of negotiate from there on what type of history should be in textbooks and what maybe shouldn't be.
I think part of it is how history is being taught as facts, as the truth, right? And it relates to what we were saying right now. It's a point of view. So maybe this could be a way out of it, we teach history exactly like chemistry and biology and these sort of sciences. So presenting history into a class, if it was clearly stated that this is a point of view and that there's a lot to be, that you were saying in your classroom, you presented 2 textbooks
right,
telling completely different things. This is not presented in our classrooms, for example. It's one history. And I assume in the past, since 2011, our recent history, every person in this room will be narrating it differently. So there's no way out to say for the history of the far past or the more far away time,
what was like for most people during this time, rather than, focusing on particular figures and particular events in history. And these are the sort of points of view, and again, the more of these points of views that you have, the more you have challenging ideas, but also developing critical thinking skills, right?
exposure is very important. The more you're exposed to, the more you see, the more you learn, right? I would say this with kids, right? If you look at a 3-year-old, you're always trying to explore, trying to learn new things. And that's what we need as adults too. We need these sort of different points of views to be able to become critical, to be able to challenge our own thinking.
Any final questions?
I'll be around if you want to talk. You're too embarrassed to ask any questions. Yeah. Okay, thank you.